November 20, 1944. The village of Geilenkirchen, Germany. An SS Panzer grenadier named Kurt Bachmann, 24 years old, a veteran of Kursk and the Falaise Pocket, was crouching behind the chassis of a knocked-out Panzer IV when he saw something that made him question what he knew about the war. 40 yards away, a Sherman tank that his anti-tank crew had hit twice in the previous 10 minutes, twice, with rounds that should have ended the fight, was firing again. Not spraying blindly. Firing with precision, its turret swinging methodically to the left to acquire a new target, loading, firing, rotating, loading again. He counted the intervals. 5 seconds between shots, then 4, then 3. He would later write that it seemed to him less like a tank and more like a machine that someone had set running and could not stop. He had fought Americans before. He had fought them in Normandy and in the hedgerows of St. Lo. He was not afraid of them. What he was, crouching in the mud behind 14 tons of disabled German steel, was confused. Because the numbers did not add up. A tank crew in combat, any tank crew, fought at some fraction of its theoretical rate of fire. Stress, fatigue, the shock of incoming rounds, the disorientation of a turret filling with propellant smoke, these things slowed men down. Every army knew this. The Wehrmacht had built its entire artillery doctrine around the assumption that real-world rates of fire degraded under pressure. It was not a theory. It was physics and biology and the data of 4 years of war. The Sherman in front of Bachmann was not following the rules. If this story shows you something about World War II you have never seen before, a like and a subscribe help it find the people who care about getting the history right. Here is the thing that makes what Bachmann saw worth understanding. The Sherman was not a superior tank. By almost every technical measure that German engineers used to evaluate armor, it was not even close. Its gun was shorter range than the Panzer IV's. Its armor was thinner than the Panther's. Its profile was taller, making it easier to hit. The Germans had a nickname for it, Tommy Cooker, because the fuel and ammunition configuration made it terrifyingly prone to fire when penetrated. At Villers-Bocage in June, Michael Widman's single Tiger had destroyed 13 Shermans in 12 minutes. German tank commanders on the Western Front had studied the Sherman the way a boxer studies an opponent's weakness, and they knew every one of them. What they could not account for, what Bachmann was watching in real time without being able to explain it, was that the men inside the Sherman were doing something no other tank crew in any army in the world was trained to do. They were performing a 4-man ballet at full speed under fire, and they had been practicing it since before they ever left the United States. To understand what was happening inside that tank, you need to go back 4 years, to a proving ground in the Maryland countryside where the United States Army Armor School was still trying to answer a question nobody had fully solved. The question was this: in a tank fight, who wins? The obvious answer is the tank with the better gun and the thicker armor. The Germans believed this deeply enough to build their entire tank program around it. The Tiger I weighed 54 tons. The Panther weighed 44. The Königsteiger weighed 68. The logic was straightforward. If your tank can kill the enemy at a range where his shells cannot reach you, and if his shells cannot penetrate your hull when he gets closer, you win. The Americans looked at the same problem and arrived at a different conclusion. Not because they were smarter or braver, but because they were, in a very specific way, more practical. The United States Army in 1940 knew it was going to war with a country that was already producing some of the finest heavy armor in the world. It also knew, with the clarity that comes from a civilian economy being converted to a war footing, that it could not build a tank that outweighed and outgunned the Tiger in the time it had. Retooling factories, training welders, sourcing raw materials for a 60-ton vehicle was a multi-year project. The war would not wait. So the men at the Armored Force School at Fort Knox began working on a different question. Not what is the best tank, but what is the best tank crew? And the answer they arrived at by 1943 would produce the thing that Bachmann was watching in the mud outside Geilenkirchen without being able to name it. Pay attention to this, because it is the piece that no account of Sherman versus Tiger ever includes. A tank engages a target through a sequence of steps. The commander identifies the target and gives a fire command. The gunner acquires the target and lays the gun. The loader selects the appropriate round, removes it from the stowage rack, and seats it in the breech. The gunner fires. The loader ejects the spent case, selects the next round, and loads again. In theory, A tank with a faster gun and a faster loader can put more rounds on target per minute than a tank with a slower one. In practice, in 1942 and 1943, this gap between theory and practice was enormous. Loaders fumbled. Gunners lost sight lines after firing. Commanders froze under incoming fire. Crews that trained individually, each man perfecting his own role, often fell apart in combat because the sequence depends on the whole being faster than the sum of its parts. Fort Knox understood this and built a training program around it that no other army on Earth had attempted at scale. The four-man interlock. Every American tank crew was trained not just in their own position, but in every other position's timing. The loader learned to have the next round in his hands before the previous case had finished ejecting. The gunner learned to be back on his sight line before the loading action was complete. The commander learned to be calling the next target before the current engagement was finished. They drilled this sequence not until they could do it correctly, but until they could not do it incorrectly. Hundreds of repetitions, then thousands. First with dummy rounds in a stationary tank on a training field. Then with live rounds on a range. Then on a range while the tank was moving. Then while a range officer shouted corrections and irrelevant information to simulate the noise and confusion of combat. The goal was not speed for its own sake. The goal was to drive the sequence below the level of conscious thought, so that when a man was cold and frightened and a round had just clipped the turret close enough to make his ears ring, his hands still moved through the sequence without his brain needing to tell them to. Think about what this means in practical terms. A Tiger crew, trained under German doctrine, was expert at its work. Each man knew his job thoroughly. Under ideal conditions, in training, a Tiger could achieve a theoretical maximum rate of fire of about 4 rounds per minute. Under combat stress, experienced Tiger crews typically achieved 2 to 3. Because the German training model, like the German artillery model, assumed that a superior weapon handled by a competent crew would win the engagement before the rate of fire became the decisive factor. The Tiger's 88mm gun had an effective range of 1,500 meters. At that range, no Allied tank could reliably penetrate it. If German armor engaged at distance, as its doctrine specified, the fight would be over before a Sherman got close enough for its rate of fire to matter. The doctrine was not wrong. It was accurate, in the terrain and conditions for which it was designed. It was a disaster in the hedgerows of Normandy, in the narrow streets of German towns, in the wooded ridgelines of the Ardennes, wherever the terrain compressed engagement ranges below the Tiger's designed advantage and handed the initiative to whichever crew could put rounds on target fastest. At close range, a Sherman crew that had drilled the four-man interlock to the point of reflex could achieve a sustained rate of fire that no German tanker had planned for and no German tank commander had been told to expect. And the Americans had built their entire tactical doctrine around creating exactly those conditions. October 7, 1944, the Siegfried Line, outside the town of Übach, Germany. Corporal James Shirley, 20, from Lexington, Kentucky, was the loader in a Sherman of the 743rd Tank Battalion, attached to the 30th Infantry Division. He had been in the tank for 6 hours. The fighting in this sector had been continuous since before dawn, a grinding, claustrophobic battle through the dragon's teeth and pillbox belts of the German frontier. At 14:22, his tank rounded a corner in the village of Merkstein and encountered a Panzer IV at a range the crew later estimated at 40 yards. This is not a combat distance. This is a parking lot. Both tanks fired within seconds of each other. The German round hit the Sherman's hull at an angle that allowed it to skip rather than penetrate. Shirley's loader instinct, the one that had been drilled into him until it lived below conscious thought, drove him through the sequence before the sound of the impact had finished registering. Round in breach. Breach closed. Fire command called. The Sherman's 75mm hit the Panzer IV squarely in the side. Then the second round. Then the third. From the moment of first contact to the third shot from Shirley's tank was 11 seconds. The Panzer IV's crew fired one more shot during that interval. It missed. The Panzer crew bailed out after the third hit. They did not know how the Sherman had reloaded so fast. There was no explanation in their training for what had just happened. Here is the number worth holding in your mind. In an engagement at 40 yards, the difference between a 6-second reload and an 11-second reload is not a tactical consideration. It is the difference between getting a second shot and not getting a second shot. And in a tank fight at 40 yards, a second shot is the whole story. But the drill that produced Shirley's timing did not exist in isolation. It was part of something larger, a philosophy of crew function that the Americans had built into their entire armored force and that German commanders repeatedly described in post-war accounts as incomprehensible in its totality. General Fritz Bayerlein, who commanded the Panzer Lehr Division in Normandy and later wrote one of the most thorough German assessments of American armor, described a pattern that he noticed not in one engagement but across dozens. American tank crews, he wrote, did not fight like men who were afraid of being wrong. They fought like men who had been trained to assume that whatever happened next would be different from what they expected. And they had been right, because their training had prepared them for variance rather than for a specific outcome. Think about what Bayerlein was describing. The German tanker trained for the engagement his doctrine specified. He knew the optimal range, the preferred approach angle, the sequence of priority targets. His training was precise and scenario-based. He was good, because German military training produced competent soldiers. The American tanker trained for the engagement that went wrong. For the moment when the tank ended up at 40 yards instead of 400. For the moment when the radio failed and the commander was hit and the gunner had to take over calling targets. For the moment when everything the manual said would not happen was actively happening. Bayerlein's assessment was not flattery. It was a tactical problem he could not solve. A German unit that outgunned the Americans on paper was not guaranteed to win an engagement in a village or a forest or a river crossing where range advantage disappeared and what remained was two crews in small metal rooms with their hands moving through sequences as fast as they could go. And in that race, the American crews had been trained by an institution that had thought about nothing else for 3 years. October 18, 1944, the same general sector, the 2nd Armored Division, Hell on Wheels. First Lieutenant Wilson Hawkins, 26, from Memphis, Tennessee, was commanding a platoon of 5 Shermans probing a road net north of Geilenkirchen when his lead tank struck a mine. The tank did not explode. It stopped, its right track blown, the crew unhurt but immobile. Standard German doctrine at this point was to hold position, call for infantry, and let the stricken tank become bait. A disabled Allied tank in the middle of a road would draw other Allied tanks forward into fields of fire already prepared by waiting German armor. The textbook move was patience. What Hawkins did instead was not in the textbook. He ordered his 4 remaining tanks forward past the disabled Sherman at full speed, not in column but spread, fanning out left and right into the fields on either side of the road. His gunners were already ranging targets before the lead elements had finished the turn. In the next 4 minutes, Hawkins' 4 tanks destroyed 2 Panzer IVs and a half-track that had been positioned to kill the Allied column as it stopped to help the disabled lead tank. The ambush that the German unit had set up in textbook fashion was destroyed before it could trigger, because the American response to the triggering condition was not what the textbook said it would be. Hawkins later described his thinking with the brevity that combat veterans often use when they explain decisions they made in seconds. He said he just didn't think stopping was going to work. That sentence should not be underestimated. The German commander watching from inside his Panzer IV had planned for the Americans to stop. His entire engagement depended on it. He had set fields of fire that covered the road in front of the disabled Sherman. He had positioned his guns for the angles he expected American vehicles to occupy when they halted. He had not planned for a platoon commander who moved through the decision to stop and out the other side before his German counterpart had finished constructing the expectation. This, more than any technical specification, was the thing that German armored officers came back to again and again in post-war accounts. Not the Sherman's rate of fire, not its radio equipment, not even the specific tactical decisions made in specific engagements. It was the tempo. The American armored force operated at a tempo that German doctrine had not calibrated for. Not necessarily faster in terms of raw speed, but faster in terms of the interval between decision and action. A German tank commander in 1944 was trained to be thorough. He identified a target, confirmed his identification, communicated his fire command through the proper sequence, and fired when the sequence was complete. The sequence was correct. The sequence was reliable. The sequence took time. An American tank commander in the same situation was trained to be right enough, right now. His fire command was shorter. His confirmation loop was tighter. His tolerance for uncertainty before action was lower, because the training program at Fort Knox had deliberately built that tolerance out of the crew's decision architecture, in exchange for speed. In an engagement at 1,500 meters, with time to acquire and confirm, the German sequence was superior. In an engagement at 40 yards, in a village, in the dark, with 4 seconds before the other tank fires again, the American sequence was the only one that worked. Here is what German armor commanders could not reconcile. They had a better tank. They had better optics. Their crews were, man for man, trained as thoroughly as anyone in the world. And they were losing tank engagements that their equipment said they should be winning, not because of luck, not because of American air superiority, which was its own problem, but because the men inside the Sherman were doing something with their hands and their reflexes that defied the theoretical advantage the Tiger and Panther were supposed to provide. Hauptmann Werner Kniep, who commanded a company of Panthers in the 9th Panzer Division and survived the war, was interviewed by American military historians at Bad Wildungen in 1945. He spoke for 2 hours about armored tactics on the Western Front. And in the middle of a technical discussion about gun traverse rates and hull-down positioning, he stopped and said something that his interviewer underlined 3 times in the transcript. He said that his crews had learned to be afraid of the Shermans in cities. Not in open ground, in cities and in forests. Because in cities and forests, the Panther's range advantage disappeared and what remained was the question of which crew could reload faster, and he had learned, at a cost he did not wish to describe, that the answer to that question was not always the one his training had led him to expect. That is Kniep's way of saying what Bachmann had seen outside Geilenkirchen and could not explain. Not that the Sherman was a better tank. It was not. That the crew inside the Sherman had been trained to win the fight that actually happened, rather than the fight that was supposed to happen, and that distinction, in the terrain where the war was actually fought, was the margin between winning and losing. Kniep's Panthers were superior weapons on the open plains of the Eastern Front. On the main street of Geilenkirchen, they were 6 feet of vertical silhouette that could not traverse fast enough to match a Sherman crew whose loader had drilled the 4-man interlock 10,000 times. Let me tell you what happened to some of the men in this story, because history does not stop when the fighting does. James Shirley, the loader whose hands had moved through the sequence at Merkstein before his brain had finished registering the impact, came home to Lexington, Kentucky, in the fall of 1945. He worked for 30 years at a tobacco auction house, married a woman named Carol Ann, raised 3 children, and never talked about the war with anyone except his son. Once, when the boy was 14 and asked how he had spent the war, Shirley told him about the Panzer IV at 40 yards. His son later said he had never heard his father describe anything with that kind of precision. The details were exact, the angle, the range, the elapsed time. As if the sequence had been burned into him so deeply that he still carried it decades later in the same place it had been when his hands used it. Wilson Hawkins stayed in the Army. He commanded armor in Korea and later served as a training officer at Fort Knox, where he was part of the generation that taught the generation after him the doctrine of variance over certainty, the doctrine of right enough right now. He retired as a colonel in 1968. He died in 1991 in Memphis. He was 73. Werner Kniep lived until 1987. He was 79 years old. In retirement, he wrote a short memoir that was privately printed and distributed among his surviving comrades. In it, he described what he had said to the American historians at Bad Wildungen and then added a sentence he had not spoken aloud in 1945. He wrote that the thing that had stayed with him longest was not any individual engagement. It was the realization, which came to him slowly over the final months of the war, that the Americans had trained their soldiers for the fight as it happened rather than the fight as it was planned. He said that in his own army, the two had been assumed to be the same thing. In the ruins of Germany in 1945, it had become clear they were not. The training hall at Fort Knox where the 4-man interlock was drilled into thousands of American tankers still stands. The building has been updated. The tanks are different. The doctrine has changed and changed again across 80 years of armored warfare. But the core insight that was arrived at by a group of officers at a proving ground in Maryland in 1941 and 1942 has never been superseded. You train for the fight that happens, not the fight you designed. You train until the correct response is below conscious thought. You train your crew not as 4 specialists but as one organism whose parts know each other's timing the way a musician knows where the next note falls before the previous one has finished sounding. Kurt Bachmann, crouching in the mud outside Geilenkirchen in November of 1944, watching a Sherman reload faster than any tank he had ever faced was supposed to be able to reload. wrote in his diary that night that he thought the Americans must have a mechanical system he had not been told about. A device in the turret that automated the loading. He could not believe men could move that quickly. There was no device. There were 4 men who had drilled the same sequence past the point of effort and into the place where the body simply does what it knows. The Sherman they were riding in would burn if a round got through the armor. Every man in every Sherman on every front knew this. And they loaded and fired and loaded again anyway, because the speed of their hands was the answer to the problem that the tank itself could not solve. 3 seconds between shots, then 4, then 3 again. Bachmann counted them, and could not explain them, and could not stop them, and finally retreated west through the dark with the sound of that cadence still in his ears. Thank you for watching this one all the way through. It means a great deal that you gave this story your time. If it showed you something about the war you hadn't seen before, a like genuinely helps. It tells the algorithm that this kind of history belongs in front of people who care about it. If you're not subscribed yet, I'd be honored to have you here. Hit subscribe and the bell so you don't miss the next one. And I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Where are you watching from today? And if someone in your family served in the Second World War, a grandfather in armor, an uncle who came home from Germany, tell me about them. These stories survive because people like you keep them.